Well, thank you very much. It's a joy to be here. And I hope in this somewhat brief time we have together, we can make this journey from Transfiguration to Transhumanism and all the way back again. So my own interest and passion for this theme began many years ago when I was looking for the right topic for my doctoral studies. And I started to see the impact that this movement was having on society, but I was a little worried. I thought, what if this is only a fad? What if this is just a fringe group that will be irrelevant a few years after my doctoral studies? But I started to see that that's not the case, and that transhumanism in many ways has permeated society, has permeated our culture. I read a book recently called Escaping Reality. And in this work, the author focused on just 4 individuals who all happen to be billionaires: Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, and Peter Thiel. And the author argues that these influential billionaires, to one degree or another, have been profoundly shaped by transhumanism. Now, many of them are not what you would describe as card-carrying transhumanists who belong to one of the major transhumanist societies. But the philosophy behind this movement does shape many of the decisions they make and many of the projects they're pursuing, for better or for worse. And so I often say that, at least in Western societies, we are often more transhumanists than we think. So I've dealt with this topic, as was mentioned, at an academic level. So I edited this work. I also have my own book on the topic that's currently under review. So if you happen to be an anonymous reviewer, please finish reading my work and get your feedback back to me so I can complete this project. But I hope to have another book out on this topic soon. I've also addressed this on a more popular level through various talks and also with someone who I believe is coming to the university soon. So I did an interview on Pints with Aquinas a while back. I recorded it a few months ago, but it just came out about 2 months ago. So if you're interested in a 3-hour Frad-style deep dive on this theme, indulge, watch, download. If you have a flight coming up, this could be some good listening for you there on this topic of transhumanism and emerging technologies. Now, when I give this presentation at other institutions, some of which are non-Catholic, it's important for me to emphasize how positive the church's perspective on technology is, because sometimes the assumption is that the church comes to hold us back from progress and to block technological progress. So I have some rather long passages here from Laudato Si in which Pope Francis emphasizes all of the great contributions that technology has made to society and can continue to make to society. So I'd say generally the church's view is one of great openness, and she has historically been on the cutting edge of technological development, and she plans on remaining there. But I imagine you are familiar with this aspect of the church. There's also some tendencies in history, you may also be familiar with, to engineer Eden, if you will, through technological development, to seek a sort of earthly salvation through our own devices. So one powerful example of this is the philosopher Francis Bacon, who at one point writes, "Man by the fall fell at the same time from his state of innocency and from his dominion over creation. Both of these losses can in this life be in some part repaired, the former by religion and faith, the latter by arts and science." He goes on to say that man can recover that right over nature which belongs to it by divine bequest. So we see already in this Baconian project of the modern period a desire to return us to the bliss and splendor of Eden, but not through religious reform alone, but primarily through our technological development. So when we start to hear about the technocratic paradigm, a favorite theme of Pope Francis and his work, we see that it's been with us for a while. This narrowing of our perspective, this effort to address the greatest problems of the day through the scientific method alone, and a tendency more and more to treat the external world as raw material that we adapt to our own desires and pleasures. We see this progressive emptying of nature of formal causes, of inbuilt final causes, and a focus on material and efficient causality, where we become the ones to manipulate the raw material around us according to our own desires and pleasures. And we've seen historically that it does not take us long from treating the outward external environment as raw material to treating our very bodies as raw material, again open to the manipulation of our particular desires. But we'll see this anthropological vision in the technocratic paradigm a bit more as we continue. So we're talking about this shift from transfiguration to transhumanism. So I'll have here some passages from Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom is a major philosopher at Oxford University. Until very recently, as until last week, he ran the Future of Humanity Institute, which just closed for some financial difficulties. But Nick Bostrom has spent years working as a philosophy professor there. And he is perhaps the world's leading transhumanist philosopher. We'll encounter a lot of great evangelists of transhumanism, like Ray Kurzweil at Google, who served as one of the chief engineers at Google, and has written extensively on this theme and has presented a very bold vision of the future. So we see a lot of missionaries, evangelists of transhumanism in Silicon Valley, but I think its most serious thinkers are tied to Oxford University. And so Nick Bostrom is probably the most influential and serious philosopher of transhumanism. And he writes at one point that while transhumanism is not a religion, it might serve a few of the same functions that people have traditionally sought in religion. It offers a sense of direction and purpose and suggests a vision that humans can achieve something greater than our present condition. And I've thrown in a bit of transhumanist art here, and I think you can see some of the parallels and perhaps distortions in comparison to Christianity. But, Bostrom goes on, unlike most religious believers, transhumanists seek to make their dreams come true in this world by relying not on supernatural powers or divine intervention, but on rational thinking and empiricism through continued scientific, technological, economic, and human development. So see the shift here. Yes, we are very similar to these older religions, says Bostrom, and say the transhumanist. And we have a lot of the same goals. We want to overcome the difficulties in life. Sickness, suffering, aging, death. These are major problems that plague all of us. No matter your country of background, your economic status, we all wrestle with this. These are major problems, and we want to do something about it. We want to address them, just like these major religions. But see the shift. Whereas past traditional religions, like you Catholics, I imagine we have some Catholics in the audience, so don't be too offended, but like you Catholics, we want to actually do something. We're not just going to promise some wonderful future in the next life. We're actually going to face these enemies directly in this life and improve this world. So for Bostrom and others, transhumanism really is a kind of alternative, a replacement for traditional religion. And just in case you've never heard of transhumanism before and you wonder, what is this priest talking about? Here is a pretty straightforward definition Bostrom was also the leading author of the Transhumanist Frequently Asked Questions FAQ document. I often say it's basically the closest you can get to a transhumanist catechism because it's very clearly laid out. It has major questions in different categories and concise responses from the most influential transhumanists. Bostrom explains that it's a way of thinking about the future that is based on the premise that the human species in its current form does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early phase. So from the very beginning of this document, Bostrom and company are laying out an evolutionary vision. But it's not about biological evolution alone. The idea is that in many ways we have been the byproduct of these blind, random biological forces. And it's gotten us so far. But now is the moment to go further. But what we need is not just a biological change. We need a technologically human-driven change. So we are in a position now to actually drive the future of evolution, primarily through science and technology. And in many ways, Bostrom is developing an idea that's present already in the 50s. So Julian Huxley, the brother of Aldous Huxley is famous for Brave New World. If you haven't read it, read that novel. If you have read it, reread it, and tell me if you can distinguish that from the newspaper. So it's a very prophetic novel. But Aldous Huxley's brother, Julian Huxley, was the first head of UNESCO and had his own mission and his own set of writings. And in one essay in 1957, Julian Huxley used the term transhumanism in its contemporary sense. And he laid it out as basically being that moment of shift from biological evolution, that we can't control, to technological evolution, which we can and should control to drive the future. And Bostrom goes on. It is the intellectual and cultural movement that affirms the possibility and desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition through applied reason, especially by developing and making widely available technologies to eliminate aging and to greatly enhance human, intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. Well, sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, no more aging, better intellectual, physical, psychological condition? Sounds great, right? So you can see here that the movement is looking at how to radically enhance or improve ourselves. So often the term enhancement is used, and it's often used to distinguish from therapy. So generally, all people are in support of medicine, therapy, taking care of diseases, repairing injuries, getting us back to a state of health. But the transhumanists want to go beyond. They want to get us to an enhanced state, and a radically enhanced state, so that we enjoy this intellectual, physical, cognitive, emotional, even moral life that goes above and beyond what most people have experienced throughout history. And along the way, we want to solve a few problems, like aging, like sickness, like suffering, and even death. Now, often in the literature, there's a further distinction between transhumanism and posthumanism. So, for many thinkers, the end goal is a posthuman state, where we are so advanced that we're no longer us. We have gone beyond this species to a higher superior state. And that higher superior state, however it's described, usually involves disembodiment. Because the great enemies of aging, sickness, suffering, and death all come back to this weak, frail lump of flesh. And if we could just get beyond that, we would be free. But in the meantime, we should settle, if you will, for transhumanism, for this state of radical enhancement. So sometimes it might seem initially contradictory, like you want this disembodied digital existence, even digital immortality, and yet you're worried about steroids or smart drugs or other forms of enhancement. But I think if you understand this kind of trajectory, it makes a little bit more sense. Not necessarily advocating it, but it makes a little bit more sense. I had an experience not long ago giving a talk, and someone walked out, and then later, I was at a parish, and someone later complained to the pastor, "I can't believe you brought this priest here to promote these crazy secular transhumanist ideas." I was like, you should have stayed till the end of the talk. So sometimes I have to put out a disclaimer there, but you can start to see some of the connections here, the rationale behind this. We want to get to this disembodied state free from all of these problems we have, but we can only do so much for now, and that involves radical enhancement. So very, very briefly, you can do a whole course. Actually, I'm teaching a course on this topic. I've taught at Regina Apostolorum before, and I'll be teaching at the Angelicum a whole course on transhumanism and emerging technology. So you can spend a whole semester looking at these different proposals. But just very briefly, to give you some sense of the thought that's out there, we'll touch on the major projects. So there's cognitive enhancement, right? We want to become smarter. And so far, most of the work in this area, most of the proposals have been at the pharmacological level. So we're very familiar with the fact that certain drugs have dual use. So you may be prescribed something, say for attention deficit disorder or narcolepsy, but if you do not suffer from these conditions, you might be able to take the same Ritalin, medicinal, or other prescription and have a kind of boost, a greater concentration, a greater level of attention. This is particularly handy in exam period, right, where you want to really be at your best or better than your usual best. So a lot of the work's been pharmacological. Now there's more exploration in terms of brain-computer interface, other approaches, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and different pathways here to get us that boost. So you can think of all the benefits to society. Just think of how much money we lose because people are inattentive, or they fall asleep at the wheel, or they're irresponsible at their job. And just think about all the great benefits to productivity if we had this greater concentration, greater focus, better memory, etc. So it's not ridiculous to want to improve our cognitive life. Susan Levine, who's writing from a non-Christian tradition, has done a lot of interesting work on this, and she's looking at some of the limits, at least to what we've been able to do thus far. It seems like in most cases there are cognitive trade-offs. So you pursue something in the hope of cognitive enhancement, but you end up losing out on something. So you want to use, let's say, methamphetamines, and maybe you gain a better working spatial memory, but there's a disruption of intentional control. Or you say, look, I know right now we're limited in what we can do in terms of the pharmacological approach, so I'm just going to go to the doctor and ask for some transcranial magnetic stimulation, right? And if the doctor says, okay, let's try it, there are some interesting experiments that you should be aware of. For instance, there have been some tests to look at performance in math, just as an example, right? So they've tried stimulating the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and they found that when that's done, the person has a great capacity in using mathematical knowledge that has just been, that has already been acquired, but really struggles to pick up new information. But if you stimulate the posterior parietal cortex, they're really good, better than ever, at learning new math, but then struggle to employ what they've already learned. So you see the trade-off? Basically, you get ahead in one area, but then you're actually a bit on a decline in the other area. So there's a cognitive trade-off in these different areas so far, plus some baseline dependent effects. So it seems like certain approaches tend to work very well when you're sort of below average in a certain measurement, but then don't really have any benefits, or maybe even start to introduce a detriment to your cognitive life when you're already at the sort of healthy range. So we see this, for instance, in serotonin, the use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It seems like there's a sort of U curve. And so once you get, if you're down below, you can get a boost, and that's helpful for your cognitive life. But when you get up to a certain level, you're starting to miss out on the benefits. In which case, it seems like what we're doing remains in the realm of therapy and doesn't really get us to the desired enhancement. Then there are questions about creativity. So imagine you get a cognitive boost, say from Ritalin, in terms of your concentration levels. Well, that can be very good for simple, repetitive tasks. But that fixation can actually prevent you from making some of the unexpected connections between different fields that having a certain liberty and freedom in your attention can bring about. So you might really excel in a particular field, but you're probably actually going to perform more poorly when it comes to creativity. Okay, so Susan Levine goes into great depth in this. She has a book called Posthuman Bliss, where she looks at transhumanism in general, and particularly at some of these proposals. But all of this to say is that there are some serious feasibility concerns. Now, I don't think we should actually rejoice in this. I don't think this should be just a, aha, got you moment. I don't have a problem and see no moral grounds for rejecting a cognitive improvement, so long as there are no other negative impacts on our cognitive life or on other aspects of our health. But we'll get to this question of therapy and enhancement as we continue. So you're probably aware of some work at Neuralink. Our friend Elon Musk, among his 10 or 15 major projects, when he's not trying to get us to Mars, he's also thinking about how to develop a computer-brain interface. And he received FDA approval to do this sort of experiment in humans. We had a few non-human animals who have sacrificed their lives to advance this project. But he has done so successfully. There's a brain-computer interface wireless chip that's been implanted, and according to reports, the patient's doing all right. God bless him. But the idea here is sort of twofold. So if you go to Neuralink and their website, the mission statement's pretty simple. So you have two major parts of this mission statement. And the first part is focused on assisting those who have serious conditions like a paralysis, right, that can come about through a stroke or through some sort of major car accident or any number of causes, right? So you think of a case of paralysis, and you can then, in a sense, through this chip, reestablish some connection with the limbs. And so to say there's a spinal cord injury and there's sort of no longer the same connection between the brain that presumably has been left largely intact after whatever incident occurred and the rest of the body, the limbs. And so you can assist that reconnection and establish some sort of limb mobility. So the idea is to get people to the point of walking, for instance, or of at least being able to communicate with loved ones in a more efficient way. So you can actually have patients that control cursors or other electronic devices. I was speaking, I think this was at lunch, with about some exciting developments outside of Neuralink at the University of California, San Francisco, where they just recently were able to combine brain-computer interface with AI technology. And they have helped a woman who suffered a stroke and who can no longer speak or communicate with the family to establish or reestablish a communication with them. And so we've actually managed to decode, if you will, the signals of the brain, particularly those associated with speech and those associated with facial features. And when you throw in an AI avatar, you can reproduce for the family the voice of this woman and also some of her facial features. Now, this does not bring her back to perfect health. It's not what you would most want for her and her family, but it's at least a positive step in the direction toward a greater communication. So that's the sort of work that most people are pretty open to. There's some reservations, but there's a general openness to that. Now, if you continue reading the Neuralink statement, mission statement, you also see the somewhat ambiguous phrase toward the end that speaks of unlocking human potential. It's not entirely clear what that means, but that goes very much in the radical enhancement line. Better memory, better facial recognition, better attention, and so forth. Perhaps even to the point of tapping into a better empathy or a greater compassion. So we're getting more into that enhancement, radical enhancement, transhumanist realm. Now, that's probably still going to take some time. At least the Neuralink technology depends on some surgery, some invasive surgery, drilling through your skull, which is not the most attractive procedure for most people. But one area that I think is very much on our horizon, that's to some degree already in our present, is the realm of brain wearables. So this sort of technology, also driven by AI, can and already has been integrated into helmets, into earbuds, into headbands, into other forms of smartwatches, etc., other forms of technology. So Nita Ferrandi, who works at Duke, has done a lot of interesting work in this area, and she published a book recently called The Battle for Your Brain, where she looks at the whole area of cognitive liberty. And she says, we need to think about this at an international level, and we need international protection for cognitive liberty, which she breaks down into three main parts, into a privacy, mental privacy, because of the data that these wearables can already obtain, and that we'll get better at obtaining. Second, a freedom of thought. We'll see why that's important. And then also a sort of freedom to self-determination. So the reason I speak about this is because you can envision a situation where certain employers or governments would be very interested in your fatigue level, in your mental state, and even, as far as it can be measured, your beliefs or inclinations. So you can see where there's a lot of room for employer or governmental control or manipulation here. Now, there are also some positive developments, right? Even with some of the technology we have right now, it becomes increasingly easier to, say, catch a seizure for someone with epilepsy. Imagine being able in the future to have ever more accurate alerts that a seizure is coming if you suffer from epilepsy. You can also pick up the first maybe subtle signs of cognitive decline, say case of dementia. And you may be able eventually, as AI algorithms develop, to catch what is pretty much imperceptible to even the best trained human doctor. And that also opens up a whole set of questions about whether you want that information, when you want that information. But these are real issues, and I said this is not just futuristic, this is yesterday to some degree. For instance, in the major train line, one of the longest train lines of China, all of the employees have these kind of smart caps that can track their fatigue levels and indicate whether they should continue or be removed. And this sort of technology has also been implemented in other parts of the world, including the United States, to track truck drivers, those working in mining, or other fields where being in a state of fatigue is dangerous not just for you, but for people around you. But as I said, there are lots of questions about privacy and how much of this data we want accessible to the people who are selling it or to governments and so forth, and how that will shape how insurance is distributed and so forth. So lots of questions on the horizon. Okay, it's not just enough to be smarter we also want to feel better, right? We want to have this great emotional life. So there's this whole realm of mood enhancements. And again, a lot of this comes at the pharmacological level, though there's also some other approaches, again, through transcranial magnetic stimulation. One area that's particularly interesting is this whole idea of love drugs or anti-love drugs. So I live in a big community of priest professors, and we get Amazon shipments of books in all the time. And so sometimes someone's kind enough to just pick up the book and say, oh, here's a book for you, and just leave it by your door, right? So sometimes I get books like this left at my door, and the other priests wonder, what's wrong with me? Why am I studying love drugs? But it's all in a day's work. So this work by Julian Savulescu, who's another major thinker who was until recently at Oxford University, he's moved to Singapore, but he was for many years at Oxford University, looks up at this idea of what if we could tap into some hormones associated with sexual attraction, romance, and even bonding. So you think of the so-called kind of cuddle hormone of oxytocin, and also vasopressin to some degree, but there's this desire to, say, boost oxytocin for, say, a couple that's been together for a long time, that has many children, that even wants to stay together, but is just starting to drift apart emotionally. What if you could boost them, say, at a hormonal level, to maintain this bond? Now, there's also the other question. What if you have an unhealthy relationship, someone who should get out, but has this, maybe everyone's thinking of someone. You can send in your names later for suggestions of who needs some anti-love drugs. But if you have this unhealthy emotional relationship, what if you could decrease? So sometimes enhancement, paradoxically, involves a decrease. It's not always just increasing something, right? So this is still very much an area in development. Also, physical enhancements, right? These are probably this is the area I think we're most familiar with, that we've heard a lot about. We're familiar with the use of doping in sports or steroid use and so forth. So most of the proposals now tend to be detrimental to health, at least in a long-term level. But the question becomes, what happens if we could avoid those long-term negative effects? And what happens when we're outside of a competitive setting, where we're no longer bound to a set of rules, but we're simply looking to live a healthier, more pleasurable, more energetic, engaged life. There's also lifespan extensions, so we're looking at different ways to extend our life. The claim that we find here on Time magazine, and that Ray Kurzweil, who I mentioned from Google, is that if we just live till the year 2045, we'll live long enough to live forever. So I think some of you here might make it. I don't know if I will, but I think some of you will. And the mentality here, the idea is that we have this exponential growth of technology, this exponential increase. And so we'll eventually get to what Kurzweil and others have described as the singularity, this point of technological explosion. Back in 2005, Kurzweil wrote a book called The Age of Intelligent Machines. And so now we're sort of wrestling around the world with this question as AI develops. And so the idea, we'll get to the singularity where the machines will be as capable, if not more capable, than we are in practically every major field. And then there will be this melding, this merging of human and machine to get us to this new state. And we, as human beings, may or may not remain in our current state. We might be obsolete at that point. Interestingly enough, when Musk speaks on these issues, people tend to wonder where he stands, because on the one hand, he's warned about the existential risk of AI, but on the other hand, he's a leading figure in AI development. So what's going on here? I think we could summarize his thinking as a sort of, if you can't beat them, join them mentality. He's concerned about what AI could do. He's concerned about misalignment in the sense that sophisticated, even so-called superintelligent systems might pursue goals or ends that are not aligned with ours, and he sees that as being bad and dangerous and potentially the end of humanity, so he's not favorable to that. But on the other hand, he thinks that if we do not come up with some sort of merging, say through brain-computer interface, we will be obsolete apes. That's the sort of language he's used. And see, this kind of evolutionary mentality comes back. If we can't find a way of merging and using this AI technology, this kind of super intelligent general AI technology, then we'll just be left behind. So we might not like the technology, we might be afraid of what it can do, but if we don't merge, we may be gone. So there are different ideas of how this will play out. This is one proposal, but as you go on, there's this ever-increasing disembodiment, right? So you want a robotic copy of the human body, then you want to transplant the brain, then you get to an artificial brain with an avatar where the personality is transferred until you eventually get to this kind of holographic state. So there's this steady trend toward disembodiment. Martin Rothblatt has written extensively on that. He's the founder of Sirius Radio, so if you're familiar with the satellite radio Sirius, he's the founder of it, but he's also a very committed transhumanist and has come up with some terminology. He's very interested in creating mind files, basically getting a copy of all of the information that is us. So all of your thoughts, desires, intentions, dreams, fears. If we could just get that information, one of the leading proposals is whole brain emulation. If you can map all of our neurons and you can get the proper information about us, about our personality, and you could store that, well then that file, like any other file, can be transferred. So that's one of the main lines of thinking. You can see a lot of these transhumanists have, we say, a patternist understanding of human identity, that we are fundamentally patterns of information, and it's combined with a good deal of materialism. So if you can get that pattern down, say into a computer system, you can get that information, you've basically captured us. But there's a lot of ambiguity even among the transhumanists, because many of them will at first say, this is our path to digital immortality. You will live forever if we can get your personality. But people like Rothblatt, I think, are actually a little bit more precise. Notice that Rothblatt here speaks of the mind clone. So it suggests that you're basically dealing with a copy, a digital copy of that person. And I think that's accurate. I'm pretty convinced that we will, with technological developments, get better and better at storing information about ourselves and capturing details about our thoughts and dreams and desires and fears and intentions and so forth. And we'll be better able to trace our neurons and better able to capture information. But, I would contend, like Rothblatt, that's basically a clone, it's a copy, it's a file. So I don't think it's really the same human person who survives and goes on to enjoy immortality. So if you want to see a sort of, television version of this, Black Mirror. Black Mirror, a decade ago, was already wrestling with a lot of transhumanist themes. This episode, Be Right Back, is one instance of that. I won't spoil anything for you. Transcendence with Johnny Depp, pre-trial Johnny Depp. This film also deals with some of these transhumanist themes, particularly of the notion of being able to download a personality and eventually upload it to a network, because that's part of the idea. We will at first transfer the personality to a better substrate. So that could be a better biological body, it could be a robotic system, but eventually we want to get beyond any particular substrate to enjoy a greater freedom. Okay, so there's a lot that can be said about this, and thankfully you study philosophical anthropology at length, and so these are themes worth a course, but I often emphasize that when it comes to this dream of digital immortality, we're not dealing with a technical problem. I think we're dealing with a philosophical problem. I don't think that it's just the limits in our capacity to gather information that's keeping us from achieving immortality. I think there's a fundamentally flawed understanding of the human person at work here. So again, I don't have time to go through a whole semester or year worth of philosophical anthropology, but I think we can, I like to take the simple example from Robert George and Patrick Lee. And years ago, they recognized that behind a lot of the major bioethical issues, there's a tendency to separate the self from the body, a dualism, a radical dualism. And I think that's at work here. So you give the simple example. Little Johnny's out in the woods and he sees a tree. And he says to mom and dad, that is a tree. Very simple. Do it all the time. We wouldn't think much about it. But little Johnny's actually doing something pretty spectacular. On the one hand, little Johnny is pointing to a very concrete object. He sees that tree. He might smell some scent. He can go up and touch the bark. He can climb up it, interacts with it. If his parents aren't looking, he might even bite into it, right? So he experiences that very concrete, say, majestic oak through his senses as an animal. He's a little animal, just like we are, right? He's a little animal. So he experiences that as an animal through the senses, that concrete tree. But at the same time, that particular object, right? He's making a universal predication. He's saying tree, speaking of an abstract, a notion that's not bound to particular, right? He's engaging in this amazing spiritual act, right? He's achieving this intellectual understanding abstraction, right? So on the one hand, a little Johnny is sensing as an animal, but on the other hand, he's making that spiritual act of understanding and now of judgment. So there's something more to Johnny. And all of that happens in that single act. So his knowledge is bound up both with the senses and with this amazing spiritual capacity to move beyond the particulars and the concrete. So George and Lee developed this at great length to basically lay out an understanding of the human person that shows that the animality, the bodiliness of the person is an essential dimension, not just a nice little add-on, and certainly not dispensable. So you see how the digital immortality project basically hinges upon this radical dualism, this idea that the body is dispensable. And it's also something that is an obstacle to this greater happiness or flourishing or fulfillment, however you want to describe it. But what George and Lee emphasize, and this is well before transhumanism was such a prominent theme, is that this animality is part of who we are. And if this animality is part of who we are, this bodiliness is part of who we are, then there's a tragic irony at the heart of the most bold goal of transhumanism. This desire to preserve humanity by removing an essential aspect of humanity. There's a tragic contradiction at work here. And that's why I say the digital immortality project, the greatest dream and aspiration of transhumanism, is doomed not at a technical level, but at a philosophical level because of a misunderstanding of who we are. But again, this is worth an entire course. There's also the realm of moral enhancement. In many ways, the idea of moral enhancement is to combine the cognitive enhancement with mood enhancement. So cognitive enhancement should get us to a point where we judge better, we understand moral situations better, we're less influenced by prejudice or bias. And then the mood enhancement comes in and actually motivates us to perform those acts that are empathetic, compassionate, and that are collaborative. And part of this project comes also from Julian Savulescu and Pearson's view that we are unfit for the future. And by that, basically, they mean we have evolved to excel in small tribes, but that tribal mentality will just not cut it when we face global threats. And they tend to talk about climate disaster. They talk about weapons of mass destruction. You could throw in today misaligned AI. Whatever the global existential risk may be, the idea is we are just not very good at collaborating with each other. So if we could create some system, some improvement that would enhance us and make us capable of doing that, maybe we could save ourselves. Okay, so there are all sorts of difficulties here that we don't really have time to go into in depth. It's just the tendency to think of emotions as being kind of good or bad. So they talk about, well, we just have to lower aggression. Okay, and some people you do have to lower aggression, but imagine removing righteous indignation. How problematic that would be for society. We may be able to intellectually identify a problem, but if we're not roused bodily, emotionally, to that indignation, we may never move. We may never make any reform in society, and we'll be much more likely to sit back passively and be manipulated. So there's a tendency to sort of misunderstand the emotions, and this is where I contend a Thomistic view of the passions and of virtue is really handy, is really appropriate to see how to form the emotions rather than think of just eliminating or increasing particular emotions. Okay, there's all sorts of questions and who decides what morality, right? Do we want a Kantian morality? Do we want a utilitarian morality? Do we want a Thomistic morality? Who decides these questions? I think there are much deeper questions at work in the moral enhancement debate. So I've talked about these different distinctions of therapy and enhancement, and the idea here is that I don't think that this particular distinction is robust enough. I think that we could get to a point of going beyond the statistical norm of health, of becoming healthier than healthy, without necessarily interfering with other goods, right? So I think if we maintain the therapeutic good, and we also make sure that we're attentive to non-physical goods, whether that be the contemplation of truth, friendship, aesthetics, community, religion, and so forth. If we're attentive to those non-material goods, I think it's possible to get us beyond the healthy state to a certain kind of enhancement. But even if we do get to those therapeutic enhancements, the bigger question is, what are we going to do with it? What is guiding us? How are we using this? Because I think these enhancements could be put to use in society and could be at the service of others, but they could also be used for very selfish interest or to manipulate others. Okay, so there's some applications of this in today's society, like Savulescu's notion of procreative beneficence, which basically says we're not at a point of designer babies, but we can already harness current technology, like in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, to get us the best children with the best chance of the best life. So it's a kind of repackaging of eugenics, though some are reluctant to accept that label of eugenics. Others embrace it, but claim that it's liberal eugenics and not bad, scary, tyrannical government eugenics, because for them the bad part is the fact that it's the government that's deciding and not the parents or the procreators. But this is just an example of how transhumanism and radical enhancement is not just about futuristic sci-fi movies, it's actually about decisions that are made here and now today about future generations. And we can already harness these technologies to pursue these ends of a better humanity. Okay, he lays that out. Okay. So, you may be familiar with this person and with this image. This is Pope Francis, who actually, I was quite disappointed to find out, did not stroll around St. Peter's Square like this. It's an AI-generated image, and if you're really attentive, you can start to pick out some of the faults and failings and quirks here, but we know we're living in an age where AI technology is developing and becoming ever more capable of fooling, tricking unassuming viewers. Pope Francis actually decried some of these images, not so explicitly, but pretty clearly in his address on the World Day of Peace. In fairness, he tends to get some of the cooler AI-generated images. I mean, there's some really horrible things that are being done now in terms of deep fake, even to the level of pornography. So that's very, very wicked and evil. But at least in the case thus far with Pope Francis, he usually gets treated pretty well in his fake images. But it's still concerning, right? How is this artificial intelligence being used? What's it being used to drive in the future, this kind of radical development? So there are cases of trying to put this to use at the service of the church. So we have things like Magisterium AI, this kind of interactive way of dealing with questions about church teaching. I recently gave a talk and met Desdemona, who is a humanoid robot, and it responds to various questions. It's put out by Hanson Robotics, which is one of the leaders in humanoid robots and using AI within these robotic systems. Thankfully, when Desdemona responds, it tends to be very clear about its identity. It will preface certain responses by saying, well, I don't really have any convictions. I'm not a human being. Or I don't have any emotions, but I can respond in this way. So you can see how some companies are attentive to distinguishing imitation reality. But we also know that not everyone wants to keep so fine a line of distinction. And that's why I think in this whole realm of AI developments, we should be particularly attentive to questions of how AI is leading us to artificial intimacy. So ever more personal, even loving relationships with our technological devices. So this movie, Her, which a decade ago seemed really out there in sci-fi, involves this character who falls in love with Samantha, basically an AI operating system. And he tells Samantha all about his day and his dreams and his failing marriage, and eventually, they fall in love. And it's so this odd situation where something is lacking in his life, and Samantha comes to fill it. And that seemed really strange in sci-fi 10 years ago, but now you can download Replica, which is an app that presents itself as your digital companion, friend, or even lover. And the appeal is that, unlike your flesh and blood friends, Replica's app is always available, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We'll always listen. We'll never criticize you. And so this app is already available, and people are downloading it and paying for it and falling in love with it in some moments. And so you can see the kind of vulnerability that we have and how companies can tap into that. All of us would like to think that we're in control of our technology at all times. But we've seen in the first wave of AI through social media that very often we tend to lose control of our attention, and that very intelligent, brilliant people know how to tap into our vulnerabilities and know how to captivate us and keep us in certain places for a longer period of time than we might like. Well, imagine if they also tap in to our hearts and they capture and enamor our hearts as well. Imagine if your great digital companion, your best friend, or your digital lover is whispering sweet nothings into your ear and then also suggesting what you should buy tomorrow or who you should vote for. Would you trust the system? Especially if that system seems to be so much more than just a computer. I think these are questions worth asking. But we'll come back to this issue, right? Transhumanism and religion. It was interesting that when Megan O'Giblin, who's a major writer, started to explore transhumanism, she was very disturbed after an initial period of hopefulness. Baggot O'Giblin had been raised as a Protestant. She went to seminary. She had received a strong theological education. But over time, she had a disillusionment with the faith. She fell away. And she thought she needed to find a more reasonable, rational, scientific approach to life. And so she set aside Christianity for transhumanism. She had been given a copy of Ray Kurzweil's The Age of Spiritual Machines. And it was a moment of enlightenment for her. She thought, this is the path forward. And yet, as she continued to study transhumanism, she was shocked to discover so many parallels to what she had learned. She saw this whole vision of exponential technological growth and these different periods, these different revolutions, and all leading toward this great promised, mysterious, almost apocalyptic singularity moment. And she said, wait, this is like the millennial kingdom. This is like the ages of salvation history that I've learned about. And she started to see these parallels. And to her surprise, she realized, wait, this movement, this techno-scientific movement, is actually demanding of me greater faith and hope than Christianity ever asked. And it's taken these ideas from Christian soteriology about salvation, from Christian eschatology about the end time and the future. It's stolen them, and it's morphed them, and it's dressed them up in techno-scientific language. But she saw through it, and she realized this is a repackaging. This is a distortion. The parallels were even deeper than Bostrom was willing to admit. And so when she realized that this was a repackaging, a retelling of Christianity, she had a second apostasy. So she left not just Christianity, but she apostatized from transhumanism and left transhumanism. And now she remains a very intriguing, provocative, agnostic seeker. Her work's quite fascinating, but she's in that seeker stage. And she's not the only one. Many authors have started to see how transhumanism draws heavily on these ancient Christian ideas and repackages them, gives a new vision for meaning and purpose in life, even for salvation. But long before Nick Bostrom or Ray Kurzweil spoke of transhumanism, even before Julian Huxley back in the 1950s used the term, a Catholic was talking about it. That's Dante. One of the greatest poets of all time. Now that I'm outside of Italy, I can simply say one of. If I were back in Italy, I'd say the greatest poet of all time, indisputably. Dante uses this term. He's made his long journey through hell, through purgatory, and finally arrives to heaven. And then the very first canto, he describes the saints. He uses the term transhumunar, this transhumanizing experience. The saints who have gone beyond the limits of human nature, but not through technology alone, not through their brain-computer interface or other devices, but through the gift of divine grace. Dante recognized something special at work here. They've gone beyond the human, transhumunar, beyond the human. But this transcendence did not lead to the elimination of their humanity. It was not a casting off of what made them human. It was a fulfillment, a surpassing that was also a fulfillment, and that began through a gift that they responded to, that they collaborated with, but fundamentally with a gift. Remember, when the church goes to canonize saints, before she jumps to the miracles, she asks the question, has this person lived heroic virtue? Has this person lived in their life in a way that goes beyond what any mere human can do? Through extraordinary courage, sacrifice, love? That's the first question. Before we even worry about begging for miracles, we ask, Is there evidence of heroic virtue? Is there evidence, in a sense, of a transhumanized life that goes beyond the the limits of human nature? And that's the type of transhumanism that Dante wants for us. So here's the phrase, trans significar per verba non si poria. So this is a very poetic, loose translation. To soar beyond the human cannot be described. So even this brilliant poet, one of the greatest, if you're from Italy, the greatest poet of all time, is speechless. Something too great to be described is at work here. We're talking about theosis. We're talking about divinization. But this is not through our own ingenuity. This is a gift. And that's what every single saint experiences. That's what's open to us. So if you go into the Sistine Chapel, you see this powerful image, one of the most famous on the ceiling. But people often fail to recognize that there's another image as you first enter into the chapel, and that's the drunkenness of Noah. So you come in, and if you're following the papal procession, because remember the Pope and his entourage would enter in procession from the back of the chapel, the first thing you see as you look up is this embarrassing image of the drunken Noah. But you see that there's also a parallel. This Noah figure is in the same posture as we find Adam. But it's a very different posture. So while they look similar, one is drunken, drowsy, inattentive, and yet here we see the splendor and beauty of God's original plan. Michelangelo here gives us a powerful experience of the beauty of God's plan and then the ugliness of sin. I think he also reminds us that God is the creator. God is the storyteller. He is the one who gives meaning and purpose and value to our life. And he shows us the way to fulfillment and happiness. And so we are not creators. We are co-creators, but we're not creators, strictly speaking. And so when we try to invent a new path to salvation, a new path to liberation, we end up with a rather sad parody, a pale imitation of the beauty that God has in store for us. And so we've made a long journey. We have this original Christian story of happiness, of beauty, of going beyond the limits of our human nature to achieve heroic virtue, to experience a divinization, to experience the divine life as saints. This call to be transformed through the gift of baptism. And yet we see over and over throughout history a retelling and a distortion of the story. And how good it is when even those outside of the church can point out that distortion. When people like Megan O'Giblin say, that story sounds familiar. I've heard transhumanism before, but it didn't go exactly like that. So the story of salvation is told and retold, mocked and distorted, and it leaves us often with a pale imitation. There are definitely great aspirations in the movement, but they're frustrated and limited by these philosophical issues, by this impoverished anthropology. And so we have this story of happiness and holiness, and it gets retold and distorted. But I see it as a cultural opportunity. If there's a longing for immortality, if there's a sense of dissatisfaction with sickness, aging, suffering, and death, now is the moment not just to mock or dismiss, but to present the fullness of the Christian life. I've said often that the problem of secular transhumanism is not that it seeks too much, but that it seeks too little. It's a quantitative extension of this life, but it fails to see the qualitative elevation to which we're called. Aging, sickness, suffering, and death has been defeated. It's what we're celebrating this Easter season. It's what we celebrate each and every day of our lives. This longing for something more is good, but the human heart and the human intellect, through sin, goes astray so easily. Our opportunity, our challenge, our calling is to represent the fullness of the Christian faith as the path to authentic salvation and, dare I say, authentic transhumanism in the Lord. Thank you.